Buongiorno, io sono, se parlo italiano capite tutti? Bene, più semplice. Sono Maddalena Tirabassi e ho avuto il privilegio di introdurre questo panel dedicato, direi, il cappello e il Canada a questo punto, anche se visto guardando argomenti molto diversi tra loro, o apparentemente molto diversi, non so se ci saranno poi delle connessioni. La prima relazione che verrà presentata da Domenico Beneventi, che è Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Sherbrooke in Canada. I suoi interessi di ricerca sono Queer Studies, Urban Writing, Canadian and Quebec Literature and Italian Canadian Literature. Ha pubblicato lavori sui contatti tra la corporalità e la marginalizzazione urbana, basati sulla marginalizzazione basata sul concetto di classe, di razzializzazione, di genere e di sessualità. È coeditor di Contested Spaces, Counter Narratives and Culture from Below e di Adjacencies Minority Writing in Canada. Domenico Beneventi è il direttore dell'FRQNSC, Founded Queer Studies in Quebec Research Group. Presenterà una relazione su Here and Now, Recent Queer Italian Canadian Writing. Thank you.
Grazie, è un piacere di essere qui in Genova, la prima volta in Genova. I will present in English, but I can answer questions in Italian as well. So recently, a number of scholars, writers, and artists who are either queer or allied have come together in readings, conferences, collaborations, and publications on queer Italian Canadian literature. The visibility of this new body of work invites many questions around the intersectional implications of gender, sexuality, ethnic and racialized subjectivity. The recently published two-volume anthology, Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, 2020-2024, demonstrates not only the diversity of the queer Italian Canadian diasporic experience, but also some commonalities, including the historical recuperation of individual and collective identities, the queering of Italian food and food rituals, and the negotiation of Italian language and its many dialects in a queer Canadian context. If previous scholarship on Italian Canadian literature has often explored the return journey as a way for the immigrant or second generation Italian Canadian to come to terms with cultural and linguistic legacies and loss, some of the contributions in collections in recent writing revisit that trope from a queer perspective. For instance, what is it like for a queer person who has grown up in Canada to go back to Italy and have to hide one's queer identity and body? In what ways do one's Italian identity figure into one's queerness? In what ways does queerness reconfigure the traditional family structure of Italian immigrant social life? These are some of the questions that will be posed in this paper in relation to this new and emerging body of diasporic Italian writing and culture. So while Italian migration to Canada can be traced back to the 19th century, this traditionally conservative, Catholic, and family-oriented community has been largely silent on questions of sexual and gender diversity. In the last 10 years or so, an identifiable body of writing has emerged by queer Italian Canadians who voice the intersectional experiences of being both queer and of Canadian and Italian heritage. Spearheaded by Galluccio's internationally famous play Mambo Italiano in the 1990s and subsequent Hollywood movie adaptation, a new generation of queer writers since the year 2000 have been writing new and exciting poetry, prose, and plays depicting the lives of this marginalized community. Despite the normalization of queer realities in Canadian society, there are still barriers to their acceptance within the Italian Canadian immigrant community. Recent writing by Italian Canadians take on the difficult questions of homophobia, silence, shame, fear, isolation, but also empowering ones of coming out, same-sex desire, validation, and the possibilities of new forms of family. The paucity, or rather invisibility, of queer writers of Italian Canadian origin may be explained to some degree by the lingering taboos around the subject matter. Some writers, filmmakers, and artists are still not comfortable writing about such personal stories. But part of the answer lies simply in demographics and patterns of migration, since the majority of Italian Canadians can trace their roots back to the large wave of immigration of the late 1960s. The transitional generation would not be writing about these kinds of subjects. It is their children and their grandchildren, born and raised in Canada, who are writing queer stories. For a community that values family, the rearing of children, and larger community networks, writing by LGBTQ plus Italian Canadians raises important questions around these social structures and institutions. How do queer Italian Canadians relate to their families and extended community? Are they included or marginalized by virtue of their sexual and/or gender identities? How do they negotiate the conventional heteronormative discourses and practices of everyday life? How do they affirm a queer identity in relation to an Italian ethnic identity? Must one aspect of identity necessarily be cleaved off from another, or is there a boundary space, a frontera, to use Gloria Andaluza's term, that allows for individuals to feel at home in both places? An attempt at incorporating two seemingly contradictory worlds in the liminal space, quote, created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. That's Andaluza. Queer Italian Canadians occupy that border space between the heteronormativity of ethnic filiations and the drifting possibilities of their genderqueer identities. So the theme of the family, or la familia, figures quite prominently in recent queer Italian Canadian writing, suggesting the narrator's desires for intergenerational understanding and connection to the past and to cultural roots. For example, in the figure of the grandmother, or the nonna, though she might be the very source of authentic memory and in some senses immigrant archive, she is also often an outsider in the Italian Canadian family, perhaps speaking only Italian or regional dialect, left to her own devices while others are engaged in their productive Canadian lives. The generational and sometimes linguistic divides that separate youth from their grandmothers is a bond woven through care, listening without judgment, recognition, acceptance. As poet Jessica Capinone writes in a recent anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, "Ma tu sei innamorata, but you are in love. I am stunned. I am 2 months into dating my girlfriend, who is certainly putting a spring in my step. But was it that obvious? She doesn't ask me any questions about my new relationship. Maybe she knows we won't have the vocabulary." For Nonna Anna by Luisa Di Filippis shows a delicate bond between Chris, a transgender young woman, and the grandmother in her care. The grandmother remembers Chris as a young boy. Quote, "The grainy images of Chris doing jumping jacks and laughing. She is dressed like a boy, short hair, overalls. She makes a funny face into the camera and blows a kiss," end quote. It is only at the moment of revelation that the willful grandmother accepts Chris as she undresses and joins her grandmother in the bath, as, quote, "the two women take each other in," end quote. Care is also shown in Erica Lenti's poem, "Why I Won't Tell My Grandmother I'm Gay." For coming out would mean estrangement from this maternal figure. Quote, "To lose this relationship would mean losing a part of my culture and identity in other facets. She is my oldest living Italian relative, the holder of customs I love so dearly." And so these cover-ups continued into adulthood, end quote. We can see here how these writers are constantly at the boundary space between secrecy and disclosure, between living authentically and mediating their language so as to maintain important bonds of affect. If these writers queer family relations, they also queer traditional Italian immigrant food and foodways. Food represents not only memory, tradition, and cultural plenitude, it is also nourishment for the body and the soul. But in this new writing, it becomes a symbol of queer identity and desire through the displacement of expected meanings around the heteronormative family meal. Food is performative, undergoing a symbolic displacement from the heteronormative spaces of Mama's Italian Canadian kitchen to queer domestic spaces that are otherly populated. Food becomes an occasion of welcome, of seduction, or of mutual recognition. And in the partaking of the pleasures communally, in her memoir, for example, What the Mouth Wants, Monica Meneghetti queers food at the same time as she claims it as her own, transforming hurtful slurs heard in childhood, for instance, finocchio, orecchione, colatino, into savory feasts that linger on the tongue. Quote, "My biting into the Parmesan makes space for others to live more authentically." Similarly, Paul Coccia's short story, Let Them Eat Manja Cake, writes of Italian food as the lure that would snag him a boyfriend, displacing in a virtuoso camp performance the role of the mother as the one who would show his love through nourishment. Quote, I would make a man-catching tiramisu so good he'd happily be in my clutches. That was my secret weapon. I earned my stripes as a good Italian housewife, end quote. Daniel Zomparelli's poem Lasagna Slow links queer seduction and desire to this most emblematic of Italian dishes, the lasagna, to the invitation to linger over shared pleasures. Quote, and this too is love, crushed tomatoes, garlic, basil, ricotta, mozzarella, ways to stay. While Jeremy Saunders' poem, The Sediment, also links the savoring of wine to an intimate moment of self-revelation between lovers. Quote, the rubescent cheek, eyes locked to their lips, a sommelier of fine wine, pouring more, decanting secrets. In her award-winning 2017 memoir, What the Mouth Wants, a memoir of food, love, and belonging, alluded to earlier, Italian-Canadian writer Monica Moneghetti articulates the sometimes painful link between immigrant memory and loss, and how these are intimately imprinted upon the body and the psyche through the sensual pleasures of food. This short collection of poetic prose, structured by the traditional four-part Italian meal, antipasti, primi, secondi, contorni, frutti e formaggi, traces the life of the protagonist from earliest childhood impressions and memories to family life and the discovery of her own body and the bodies of others, the loss of her mother to cancer, and finally to her sexual awakening as a polyamorous bisexual woman. The collection depicts how embodiment and affect are imprinted in memory and recirculated through narratives of family loss and queer awakening. And it is through the physical and emotional nourishment, in every sense of the word, that the protagonist remembers a past that is both troubling and seductive, and looks toward a future that is both queer and utopic. The memoir not only explores the links between the body and language, sexuality, food, and Italian-Canadian identity, it also fascinatingly explores the affects and sensations of the body, from the resonant and dull ache of mourning for the absent mother, which cannot be adequately described through language, to the contrasting affects of fascination and repulsion, pleasure and disgust on the border zones between the insides and the outsides of bodies, between the self and the other. I have a few quotes here. The memoir is dense in its evocative, sensational, sensual language of the body of affect, of desires, perceptions, taste and smell, and textures, of foods, of other people, and of sexuality. The memoir begins at the very beginning of life with the first poem titled Tongue, in the fusion of the mother and child in the womb, where the body of the self and of the other are not discernible. The eponymous organ is the instrument of language, but also of speech, of taste, and of pleasures beyond. Here we see the whole of a life unfurl in the sensations of touch, of the pre-linguistic body, as the author imagines her own body fused to that of the mother, cocooned in the womb for protection and subsistence. Quote, the tongue lies within, from the beginning, within the pelvis, within the flesh, within nerves, skin, aura, air, solar system, Milky Way, and cosmos, end quote. The tongue here signals a connection to self, other, and the external world. It is the body part that will reveal language and the first form of bodily penetration, the infant introducing her fingers into her mouth. Sensuality and affect are pre-verbal, and the infant's body is circumscribed by the various sensations through which it will create a physical and psychic boundary between the self and the mother or the other. Quote, and the thumb will follow by air, by nipple, by milk, and from then on, many things will enter our mouths, end quote. The tongue, quote, learns to shape vibrations, exaltations into intelligible sound and invites the lips to co-create. The tongue wields words, oiled wood or acute steel words, keen stone or rough club words until our bodies cease, end quote. The tongue later discovers other tongues, symbolically here evoking other languages, English or Italian, but also physical tongues in moments of sexual encounter, wherein it quote, recognizes itself in another and exclaims in pleasure or disgust. So the performative or confessional aspect of queer writing is an important part of the cultural and intellectual work at hand. As Sedgwick makes clear in her discussion of the epistemology of the closet, the interdictions around same-sex desire function precisely in the power of silence, invisibility, and the erasure of LGBTQ+ realities in public discourse. And in order to break such an impasse, one must speak up or speak out. Salvatore Antonio has touched upon these issues: the silencing of the closet, the desire for reclaiming Italian identity by queerly displacing it, and the ways in which queer people experience public and private spaces as sources of potential danger or disclosure, but also as spaces of intimacy. In the queer characters in this play, Gabriel's Kitchen, Salvatore Antonio plays explore, occupy, and even create heterotopic spaces of queer Italian Canadian sociability. They also attempt to reconfigure the heteronormative spatiality and temporality imposed upon them by trying to stop or freeze time in moments of bodily intimacy and pleasure. They inhabit queer spaces, but also queer the spaces they inhabit by representing alternative spaces and temporal mappings of Italian-Canadian domesticity. I want to suggest that the schism between queer Italian-Canadian youth and the previous generation emerges not only from the difficulties around the disclosure of sexual identity, the proverbial coming out of the closet, but also from a more fundamental schism between what Sarah Ahmed has described as a queer phenomenology and what Edelman suggests subtends heteronormativity, the promise of the child alluded to earlier, quote, an erotically charged investment in the rigid sameness of identity that is central to the compulsory narrative of reproductive futurism, end quote. So in Gabriel's Kitchen questions Italian-Canadian performances of hegemonic masculinity, particularly in that of the patriarch Paolo, whose immigrant fantasy of class mobility is invested in the figures of his two male children, Marco and Gabriel, who come to symbolize the promise of a heteronormative futurity around the continuation of the family name. But the play asks, what happens if the immigrant child is queer? The silence and silencing of the main character of Gabriel in Antonio's play is central to the drama and leads to his suicide and the subsequent silencing of other members of the family in failing to acknowledge the traumatic moment in which Marco finds his brother hanging from a support beam in the family's unfinished basement. The refusal to hear or acknowledge queerness in the immigrant Montesanto family, and by extension, the Italian-Canadian community, is a performative gesture intent on maintaining the fantasy of a heteronormative patriarchal order, something which the play explicitly stages through the figure of the long-suffering mother, Concetta, who symbolically looms over a moment of queer intimacy between her son and his partner, while refusing to see her son's queer truth. Moments of seeing, of not seeing, recognition or misrecognition occur repeatedly throughout the play. Paolo not recognizing his son for who he truly is, Concetta refusing to imagine her son in moments of intimacy with his boyfriend Matt, despite her suspicions, and Marco witnessing the traumatic moment when he discovers the dead body of his brother hanging from the basement. So by way of conclusion, I would suggest that the domestic spaces of the Italian and Canadian family home is a heterotopic space inflected by Old World and New World languages, cultures, but also defined by the power dynamics of rigid gender roles and normative heterosexuality that in effect demands real or imagined forms of temporal or spatial displacement or escape into a utopic future for queer Italian Canadian subjects, new forms of family and filiation, and taking tradition into queer new directions. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping time and for giving us a quick overview of what literature is about this. I think we have question and answer at the end of the panel, as everybody does here. And my comment would be, and my question would be, to be more specific about the generation you're talking about, because I think it's very important, because it's very important to always to make parallel between Italy at the time when they left Italy, how is it now, and how mentality can change, if migrants communities might change in time as Italy is doing or not. So, but we'll talk about this later on. Now let's go to this to a completely different subject with Abril Liberatori. She will talk about digitalizing diaspora, building an Italian-Canadian digital archive. But she has, first of all, a few words about her. She's an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Mariano Elia Chair in Italian-Canadian Studies at York University, Toronto. She also serves as president of the Italian-Canadian Archives Project and vice chair of the Canadian Committee on Migration, Ethnicity and Transnationalism. Her research and publication primarily focus on identity formation and the cultural life of post-war Italians in the Americas.
Thank you very much. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
I was going to see if I can stand up, but we'll see if you can still hear me. And I'll be loud because I know lunch will be setting up shortly, so please let me know if you need me to speak louder. All right, so my presentation today is a little bit more of a state in the field of what we've been up to with this project. It's very early stages for the project, but it's kind of a moment of pause to check in with what we've done in the last year or so and where we're going next. And so I very much look forward to a conversation. So I'll try to kind of introduce the project to you, and then I have some questions for discussion that I'd be very happy to kind of have a conversation. I think it's a small enough group that we could do that if we have some time to do. So I will quickly go through who we're talking about, who's involved with the project, an overview of the project itself, walkthrough of kind of the process of bringing it together, and then where we're going next and some questions for our discussion. So the project is a partnership between the Italian-Canadian Archives Project, or ICAP. ICAP is a nonprofit charitable organization. Its mission is to connect, engage, and assist communities and individuals in preserving their materials, identifying their materials, collecting them, ideally connecting them with institutions who might be interested in long-term preservation of them as well, but also kind of educating communities or individuals who might not be ready to donate materials and how to best preserve them at home. The Mariano Elia Chair in Italian-Canadian Studies at York University. I'm the chair holder currently. The Elia Chair was established in 1984, so it has quite a long history. And it was created, and I'm reading from the memorandum, to promote knowledge of the Italian-Canadian experience and its contribution to the development of Canada through things like teaching, research, conferences like this one, publications, outreach events, community events, things like that. So my role is kind of in between both of these things, of course, but we also wouldn't have been able to do a project like this without the support of things like the Dean's Award for Research Excellence in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York, as well as the federal Canadian program Young Canada Works, which provides young current students and recent graduates with opportunities in the heritage field. So through both of those programs, we were able to connect with and hire two young workers, young students, to work with us to develop the Digital Archive website and to work with us as a digital archives assistant, bringing things together. So I'll talk a little bit more about them as well. A little bit of a project overview, what we're working on. So the ICAP Digital Archive is intended to be an online digital repository space that permanently preserves archival collections related to Italian-Canadian history and heritage. It collects documents, materials, and stories that accompany those documents and materials. And the idea is to strike a balance between long-term preservation and public access to those materials. So you can see some overview of the descriptions. The idea is to have attractive, accessible exhibits based on those materials, things like oral histories, interactive web elements, and collaborative captions are things that we're looking at in the future, so I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit more. And I put here at the end the challenges of closing that gap, because in ICAP's history, ICAP has been active for about 15 years, but that is a challenge that we've identified in the field, where a lot of archival institutions are sometimes not knowledgeable about the history and so might not identify the value of materials. So ICAP's members, heritage professionals, academics can speak to that value and advocate for it. But often archival institutions just don't have the resources, don't have the funds or the resources or the physical space. And so, as I'm sure it happens in other places as well, in Canada, a lot of archival institutions are really bound by those restrictions. And even if they might want to take materials, they don't have the resources to do so. And we also identify challenges on the other side, on the side of communities or individuals who often are not familiar with archival institutions at all and what it represents to donate to an archive. And so the education piece of educating potential donors on what a donation implies, right? We've seen instances where someone is very hesitant to donate somewhere that takes their collection away from the community, understandably, and this is an archival practice that we're now talking a lot more about, of leaving documents close to their communities. We've seen instances quite often of donors donating and not realizing they can't get their materials back so easily, right? So a lot of the piece of educating donors and finding opportunities for safe preservation that honor the donor's priorities. Right, so this was one of the features that we were hoping the digital archive could kind of close that gap a little bit. So in terms of the process of how we've brought the digital archive together, and like I said, it's still early days, so I might have more questions for you than answers, but in terms of how we've built this so far, the first step was really lots and lots of research and development, and I say the first stage, but that's something that continues on, as I'm sure we all know from our research. This involved hundreds of hours of consultations with archive and heritage professionals across Canada and sometimes in the States. Also consultations with other community digital archives, CDAs, or community archives that don't work in the digital field to kind of understand their challenges and their priorities, what they wish they would have done when they started out, things like that. And attending a lot of archiving workshops. So I'm trained as a historian, so I'm familiar with using archives as a historian, but it's been very humbling and very educational for me to kind of be put through the process of learning things from the other side and really becoming very sensitive to how archivists view these types of projects, the priorities that they have, the pitfalls that we'd hope to not fall into, that kind of thing. From those consultations, we also built an extremely long digital archive governance document. In those consultations, we were very aware of the priorities from the archives field and how closely, ICAP being a collection of archivists, heritage professionals, academics, and community members, we were aware of that, but in those consultations, we became even more sensitive to it, and we wanted to make sure that we had good policies in place to launch the project, always understanding that a governance document changes as we learn things and as we develop the project itself, but including at least a first development of a donor agreement. Again, a donor-centered archive was really important to us, so the donor agreement had to be robust and really helped flesh out the details of how we want the project to look. An appraisal policy, what we can accept, what we can't accept yet, what we might accept in future, and what we would need to get there. Checklist and lists of what we might include in our metadata to help our students kind of have a structure to follow. Procedures, workflow, that was also an aspect that became very clear in speaking to so many archivists. Was in projects like this, you're working with a lot of students who are on short-term contracts. And that means that a lot of people are cycling through the project and you have very little institutional memory. So having these types of materials that clearly delineate the workflow was something that was really hammered home to us during those consultations. Once we did that, that's when we were able to bring our two students in. Natasha Fomenko was our YCW archives assistant. Sydney Samoda was our DARE student who helped us develop the website. Sydney was very much involved in step 2, which was choosing a platform for the digital archive. She did extensive research on, as you can see, some of the other options that we considered. We did end up going with Omeka, which I think many people in our field are familiar with. There's a free version and you can kind of upgrade up to your needs. there was lots of other services we could have gone with, and we had some front runners, and I'm happy to talk about that if you're ever considering a similar project. The nice thing about Omeka, as you can see here, some really good options that fit what we were trying to do well, but ultimately this last point I think is important, the fact that you can transition an Omeka site into something else. So we are aware that, you know, this is a long-term project and it may move or look different several years in, and so the fact that we have the flexibility to adapt, that was important. Okay, step 3 is starting to build the collections themselves. And this is where Natasha, our digital archives assistant, came in. And really, as you can see here, the kinds of questions that we were asking and the priorities that we had. So I will say we wanted to start small while we were working on kind of building what the digital archive would be. So we're building from scratch. This is a project that doesn't exist. And so to kind of carve out the parameters of what we want that to look like, we also wanted to work with donors that are quite close to us that we could come back to, correct anything or fill in blanks. So we worked with ICAP board members who had small collections so that we had a kind of that close contact and existing relationship. And yeah, asking questions like, what will the process look like when we donate? How do we try it out with this collection? Asking, and again, because of that priority of having donor-centered, a donor-centered archive, making sure that we have a constant back and forth with the donor and making sure we get the stories behind the documents. And lots of archivists will tell you about the pitfalls of having fantastic photographs that you know nothing about. So making sure that we can connect materials with their background, their metadata. And then the digitization took place, and this was really Natasha, our student, who took on the brunt of the work. We were lucky enough to have some funding for a nice, good scanner that we were able to take high quality copies, and she really learned the inside and out of how to use the scanner as best as possible for our project. And while doing the work itself of scanning, photographing these items, cataloging them into Omeka, inputting the details, inputting the metadata, also in parallel writing us a guideline of how to do that for the next student who will come and do that work. So now we have both not only the collections that she helped us develop this year, but also a structure, an institutional structure in place for the next time we hope to do it. So overall, we built 3 collections this past summer, and we digitized just under 328 items in total. Here you can see an example. I'm not sure if you can see it from that far, and I would have loved to kind of give you a walkthrough of the digital archive itself. The whole website, I think, is quite beautiful, and you can see the 3 collections, but because of our limitations with the access, I won't be able to do that, so I tried to show as many pictures as I can. But you can see kind of on the back end what Natasha was working with and what it starts to look like once it's on the public-facing side of the website. And step 4 in the process was then building exhibits. So we had these 3 collections, or funds as they might be called in the archive world, but again, we wanted to prioritize not only the safe preservation of those through the digitizing, through the building of the metadata and building the collection, but also make them accessible to the donor, to their families in Canada, but also around the world, and to others, researchers, other community members, people like you who might be interested in seeing those types of collections. So for each of the collections, we built corresponding exhibits. And the nice thing is that all 3 collections that we had were quite a bit different. The first one was, I think, about 20 documents, some photos, some written documents. It was quite short, had very cohesive story to it. The second one was a result of a now professor, it was his PhD research, so it was 10 families from a small community. And so the exhibit kind of starts as one exhibit and has like sub-exhibits to it for some of the families that are featured in the collection. And the third one is a larger collection of a step migration. So kind of showing 3 different ideas of what an exhibit might look like and what we were able to or not able to work within those resources. That was very useful as well. And again, in the building of those corresponding exhibits, the access piece was important, the donor story was really important, so we had either one of us or Natasha kind of present in taking those stories, making sure that those stories went back to the donor for clarification to see if it was reflecting the story that they were hoping to tell us. This was an optional, but we were likely biased by having ICAP more board members this time. Everyone was very eager to participate in this part. But I suspect from my experience doing oral histories in the past that usually people like to talk about their document, right? If they're ready to do something like this, they want to tell you the stories that accompany them. So that was very important to us. And then those stories were written up, went through proofreads, things like that. And as you can see, you have on the left here kind of how you can browse the digital archive itself in terms of kind of the files in the same way you would see a box in the archive and you would go through the materials. But then you can also go to the exhibits and you would see what you see on the right here, which is kind of a story including a selection of those archival materials to kind of bring the story to life if you're interested in kind of that perspective on it. Lastly, again, and this is something that our students helped very much on, is matching items. Again, a lot of the fine-tuning of things that archivists reminded us is extremely important and stuff like this. And formatting blocks like this, which as you can see from the right-hand side, that's what it ends up looking on the back end, or on the front end. Omeka has nice capabilities for building relatively simple exhibits, so we were able to work with that, and that was Sydney, our webmaster extraordinaire, who helped a lot with building the design of that as well. And again, Sydney helping us very much writing some custom code when Omeka wasn't able to accommodate something, and troubleshooting tons and tons of little glitches that historians wouldn't know or maybe realize, but someone who's trained and good at looking at that kind of stuff was able to provide a much more friendly user experience. So if I do say so myself, I think it's a quite attractive site and easy to navigate. So next steps in discussion. In terms of next steps, we've spent quite some time this fall developing some funding applications that will hopefully result in additional funding for next phases and of being able to bring in new collections and kind of fine-tune the process and see what works, what doesn't, fine-tune the governance document. We're very interested in developing the donor agreement further. We know donor agreements are hefty documents and can often be a barrier for donors. They're either in like legal jargon that people don't understand, or kind of the written, just written text can be very intimidating for some of the communities that we're working with. We're also very sensitive, and again, because of all of our consultations, we know that it's important to build legacy plans and refine kind of migration plans for the project itself. So I spoke to one archivist who said, like, the road to hell is paved with dead links. Right, this idea of so many of us in heritage or museum history, these kinds of fields are often very enthusiastic about mounting projects when we get some funding for them, and then what happens after, right? So a lot of archivists are like, what happens after? How are you going? And it's funny, I've been in so many panels this week and in past conferences where people talk about these fantastic materials, and now my question is always like, how are you going to make sure they stay safe? Like, what happens, right? So we're very sensitive to that, and that's something that we'd like to make sure that we have a good plan for. In future, we have some lofty goals, things like including oral histories directly on the site or as part of the exhibit so that you can hear or see the person speak about their documents. We would also love to incorporate some interactive elements. We've seen other projects that incorporate collaborative metadata so that if you recognize someone, you can add your contribution, and that can be kind of a community building effort, interactive maps, things like that. So this is all something we're hoping to roll out. And then in future phases, we would love to go back to some of ICAP's early work, which is making more explicit connections with brick and mortar archives who maybe don't have the resources in the moment, but might be able to provide some in-kind supports, right? Just the physical limitations right now imply that our big giant scanner and our students are in the Toronto area in Canada, but this is very much a pan-national project, and it's very important to us to get the story of Canadians all over. And there are Canadians all over. There's Canadian communities all over Canada that, if you know our geography, are quite far. So we would love to be able to work with institutions who are in other places who maybe might be able to provide scanners that we can get students in the local community to work with or something like that. So lots to do still. It's early in the project, but my first motivation was to bring your attention to a project like this, to connect with someone who might be interested in that or who has information on similar projects. And then the next motivation is to discuss questions like the ones you see above, which are questions we've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about, and I think are important for all of us who work with diasporas and especially with communities, local communities, to think about. So things like, how do national institutions provide space that's maybe decentralized? Can they? How can we center communities? How can we represent diversity of experiences? And that was kind of our first attempt at 3 somewhat different collections, but how can we do this well? How can we do this with understandably limited parameters so far with regards to appraisal? Number 3 is, how do we toe the line between, again, this question of accessibility and sustainability? So having materials be accessible to you or to anyone who needs them, but also make sure that they stay safe, right? This concern from so many communities of being able to access their materials, I think we need to take that seriously. And then number 4, how do we manage the long-term viability of projects of data security in a nonprofit space, which ICAP is, even in an academic space, which often relies on short-term funding. So happy to chat about any of this or anything else, but I'll stop there so we can chat. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like vorrei solo sottolineare che uno degli aspetti importanti della nascita di un nuovo archivio è quello di calamitare, di attrarre la documentazione dal circondario, insomma, dalla società, e di consentire di scriverne poi la storia. È un momento molto importante tutte le volte che si apre un nuovo archivio, un nuovo museo, e quindi siamo molto coscienti. L'altra, giusto un suggerimento, è il grosso dibattito sulla digitalizzazione e sulla conservazione della digitalizzazione in qualsiasi forma essa avvenga, perché noi abbiamo un'esperienza parallela, stiamo costruendo in questi giorni, in questi mesi, l'archivio del centro Altra Italia, che è un archivio di un centro di ricerca che è nato 30 anni fa, con materiali poco antecedenti. E ci siamo appunto, come voi, consultati con archivisti di ogni sorta, siamo giunti alla conclusione, parlando con tutti gli archivisti italiani perlomeno, benissimo la digitalizzazione, ma tenete la carta, non buttate via niente. Questo ci ha messo in un oceano di lacrime, perché ovviamente non ci consente di conquistare gli spazi che uno sperava. Però la carta si è conservata nei secoli, gli archivi di carta si sono conservati, abbiamo perso con la digitalizzazione chilometri di annate di riviste, di bollettini, non abbiamo più le lettere degli emigranti, per dirne una, non abbiamo. Il lavoro che stiamo svolgendo ora è quello di raccogliere le storie dei nuovi migranti e di tenerle su più piattaforme possibili, con più materiali possibili. Ora, mi sono intromessa in un argomento, però l'esperienza di tutti questi anni è stata un po' questa, perché con i media siamo saltati dai floppy disk, pensate anche solo alla musica, quanti registratori abbiamo buttato via e quante cose poi siamo andati a ripescarli dalle soffitte perché se no non possiamo più sentire la voce del nonno, per dire. È è una questione molto attuale e di cui non nessuno ha la soluzione, però dobbiamo esserne consapevoli quando parliamo anche di archivistica e di cambiamenti digitali di questi anni. Scusate, mi sono intromessa invece di... sì, abbiamo una domanda.
Grazie, chiederei in inglese, però se necessario posso anche ripetere la domanda in italiano. Firstly, I'd like to thank you both for your presentations. My name is Daniel Melfi. I'm also from Toronto and grew up in an Italian-Canadian household, so it's always interesting to hear these stories that I think we actually experienced firsthand. My question is for Abril. I am a doctoral research candidate at the Università di Firenze, researching the representation of Italian immigration through home movies, specifically in the US and Canada. And so I'd like to respond and ask you also about the first of the discussion questions you had. And the question is, how important is, or have you experienced or experimented with community engagement, such as open calls to have people donate materials specifically through events? And I ask because I'm working since a few years with Home Movies Bologna, which is l'Archivio Nazionale del Film di Famiglia. And this has often had a big success for them in many ways. The first is a logistical success. It brings a lot of material. People hear about the event and they come to often project their films and have a discussion. And the second, which is also an interesting and important, often difficult question to address, is it helps address this donor agreement issue. It helps really communicate the importance and end result of what it means to donate your material to an archive. I can imagine with photos it can be a bit difficult because people really like to hang on to them. But in my case, that I'm working often with Super 8, 8mm, and 16mm film, my argument is often, let's be honest here, when was the last time you screened these films? Do you have the equipment to do so? Are you really capable of doing so? And are you aware of the fact that due to the materiality of film, you could very well damage it? So I have a lot of arguments. I know that with photographs or letters, for example, it can be a bit more difficult because it's very possible that people might engage with those materials again. So thank you again, and I'd like to know if you have any experience or opinions on this.
I have so many opinions, and I'm happy to chat more about the details, but so in terms of have we experienced that? Not yet, because we're still so early in the project. Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of for a reason. We're trying to, we're just now getting the word out because we've gone through the first phase of it and kind of seen like, okay, something's working here, we can build momentum. But I have to say, even in that short time, almost anyone I've spoke to has said like, oh, I have stuff. And so we're actually dealing with the opposite right now, where we want to make sure we have enough resources to do things well, instead of kind of having backlogs of boxes that aren't being stewarded in the right way until we can get to them. So, but this is absolutely the plan of doing community events like that, like scan-a-thons, very education-focused events where we can kind of explain what the process is. And something I didn't mention, and I should have, is that the project mimics some other community digital archives that where copyright remains with the donor. So they actually keep their physical copies. We provide a digital scan, a high-res digital scan that is posted on the website, so it is publicly available, and they need to know that they're kind of putting their materials in a public sphere, but they get their copies back, and I think that's really significant, and that is a barrier for many people to donate materials. So we're hoping that something like that, we know it's not a perfect solution, of course, we would love to retain that physical copy as well, but we're hoping something like this is an entryway into having communities speak about preservation as a value while also giving them a service that they get to keep a high-res copy that they can then distribute to family members or keep for themselves, but then open that conversation with them about potentially now we can connect them with their local archive and talk about, you know, donating that physical copy down the line. So these are conversations we're having. We're not there yet, but absolutely. And I was going to ask you, you said home movies? I love this project. I think that's wonderful. I don't know if you know the C'è Posta per Te from out of Montreal. So like, yeah, it's wonderful stuff being done, and I'm happy to chat further.
I just wanted to ask you, you said that there's collaboration or you would want collaboration. Have you spoken or are you in touch with the Italian-Canadian archives of the Casa d'Italia? And what is your experience and how, if there is any collaboration, what it is?
Yes, so Nancy Morelli at the Casa d'Italia Archives is on the ICAP board, so we're in constant communication, and she's one of the people that is helping us look through this, as well as some other archivists in Calgary and Vancouver. So our ICAP board is made up of some academics, some community members, some people in the museum and heritage sector, and archivists. But we also want to grow that network to archivists who work in other fields that might not be part of ICAP but might be interested in a project like this just from a community perspective. So already very important connections, I think, but we're looking to grow that as well. Thanks.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much to both speakers. You gave us different perspectives on similar topics dealing with the Italian legacy in Canada. I have a question. Actually, I wish to provoke both of you because especially the lady, Miss Domenico. No, sorry, Miss Abril, Liberatori. You speak about community-oriented projects, you speak about community legacy. I wish to ask you what you intend as community in Canada, Italian community in Canada. We are mainly linguists and anthropologists. We have been working for the last 10 years in Ontario collecting data concerning the language legacy and the cultural legacy of Italian Canadians. And as far as we have understood, there is no one single community at all. So it is as if this kind of identity, diasporic identity, has been fragmented into many, many different cultural and linguistic aspects, which are very difficult to deal with in considering just a single community. So what do you intend as that, first of all? And the second question I wanted to ask to Domenico Benvenuti concerns the contribution of this kind of Italian-Canadian writing literature in the general context of contemporary literature in Canada. It is very hard for us to understand it from far because we are in Italy, okay? So mainly the mainstream of studies in Italy is to conceive these forms of culturally oriented literature as part of the Italian legacy only. But still, I wish to ask you, which are the connections with similar genres, literature genres in Italy? I mean, is there any connection at all? Or you consider this kind of heritage just a Canadian heritage as such? Thank you.
Well, I mean, there certainly are connections with Italy. I think in the kind of writing that I talked about, there's always this kind of problematic relationship to Italy, right? Because it's the past, it's memory, it's something that needs to be recuperated and so on. But there's also the question around, especially gender and sexuality, the problematic question of acceptance and so on, like in Italy, that some of the writers struggling with, right? So Italy is both something that is inspirational, something that is very affective, right? Because for Canadians growing up, who were born in Canada, growing up in Canada, the Italian language and culture is very much tied to childhood, to family, and so on. So it's very affective. You feel it, and so on. So you see this in the writing a lot, right? And so there's this sense of wanting to reclaim that kind of identity, right? And when you ask the question about community, it's interesting because, like, the specifically queer Italian Canadian community, something that is new and is emerging. And it also has a problematic kind of relationship to the larger Italian Canadian community, right? Because of the specificity of queerness, of gender, right, expression, and so on, right? So again, it's something that is relatively new, right? I was mentioning 1980s, where this writing starts to emerge. But I think we've seen quite a bit of production lately, in the last 10 years or so. And it's always a struggle between, you know, can we bring together one's sense of a queer identity and one's sense of an Italian identity? And that's why you see things like food as an example. Food becomes a way to bridge the gap between those two communities. Food is very central, very affective. It's very much tied to family, to childhood, to memory, and so on. But then you can use food in a queer kind of way, like the example that I showed, right? So, you know, it's something that is constantly being negotiated.
May I introduce a note from this power position at the table? I have the feeling that there is more room for queer literature in Italy than in Canada, than within the Italian community in Canada. I mean, if we watch nowadays Italian TV, Italian sitcom, and so on, you always have a token, I don't say BLG, okay, person. Even too much, I mean, it's just put there, it's a token, you know? It's very much, so I would say, but on the other side, in terms of discussion on freedom of expression and so on, it has been a very long debate, and I would think that in terms of the publishing industry, there is more room for queer literature than in Canadian or US or wherever, diasporic Italian communities abroad in the market than of normal emigrants, quote, within breaks, normal emigrants literature. People are kind of tired of seeing the same story about immigration. We have a lot of TV series and so on. And so the subject, different subjects have more room to me as queer studies and queer novels than just plain talk about immigrants. Because the story, la narrazione sulle migrazioni è veramente di una retorica un po' nauseante per noi studiosi, no? Magari può raggiungere qualcuno in più, però si è fatta è stata molto standardizzata. Invece questo genere di letterature qua, non per un pubblico enorme, ma per un grande pubblico di nicchia, c'è più spazio, e c'è più spazio rispetto forse anche alle comunità che non esistono. Ecco, la parola, io come storica cerco di non usare più la parola comunità quando parlo di emigrazione, perché le migrazioni italiane sono talmente stratificate che se aveva un senso parlare di comunità, forse quando si parlava di vere Little Italies nel mondo, fino a metà Novecento va bene, ma oggi mi sembra che non esista come... forse c'è una comunità online, nel senso dei blog, se vogliamo chiamarli comunità, ma insomma sono gruppi di... ecco, chiamiamoli gruppi, ci sono i gruppi di discussione, ma non ci sono le comunità. Scusate, sono un po' confusa, ma le cose che stanno emergendo sono talmente tante e interessanti che...
If I can add to that, I think the project is really interesting. My question around immigration is it's very often tied to affiliation, right? So generational affiliation. Where does queerness fit into that, right? When we think about diaspora, when we think about immigrant communities, it's often a narrative that passes from, parents to children and so on, right? And so what happens there's a disappearance. I'm wondering, the question to you is, do we see archives that have queer content in them? Because that's a different kind of diaspora, right? And so how do you create a story of immigration, a story of diaspora that includes a kind of a queer history, right?
That was my question for you about generations, because you mentioned that, and I think it's very, very interesting. And to touch on your question, which I think is a great question, and we usually use the plural communities to give us a little bit of wiggle room in the fact that this is a complicated word to use. Yeah. But it's an imperfect word, and something that has come up in this last year of consultations with archivists as well is like, perfect is the enemy of done, right? Like if we hope to have a perfect product, we're never gonna do it because it's hard to start with perfect, right? So we're doing the best we can, but a lot of times we use this word because the communities themselves are using these words, and I'm talking about like small local communities, often represented by an association. Of course, we know that those associations often have a very specific image and that not everyone in the geographic area or that might belong to a geographic community belongs. We know that it's imperfect, but yeah. Well, this is what I was going to say, and just if I can give some quick thoughts, is first of all, this is something that I think we probably all are familiar with, not just in Canada, but in Canada, this is a big challenge, right? Is how much to seek national unity of diasporic Italians, how much to respect that there isn't one, the tensions and conflicts between them, and also the commonalities between them. There's always that kind of fighting, and some argue that kind of tension has resulted in like less progress in terms of stuff like heritage preservation. I'm not sure that I can insert myself in those debates. I'm not sure my perspective on it is like fine-tuned, but it's absolutely what you identify as an issue that we're working with. I will also say within the context in the Canadian context, we're also working with, the effects of multiculturalism as a federal policy and the programs and the funding that were put in place from that, which used that terminology a lot. So we are kind of in a new phase where we can complicate that a little bit and expand our thinking a bit, but that's also a legacy that we work with. To add to that, a lot of the communities we work with, a lot of the collections we work with have multiple ethnic or racial identities, right? So how do we talk about that? And I think that was one of the questions I asked, is like the diverse experiences that encompass what we might call Italian Canadian, which again is also a contested term, right? You have people with strong opinions about using Italo-Canadian, Italian Canadian, Canadian Italian, Italian descent. So there's a lot of like conversations we can have around this stuff. But yeah, I think I'll stop there. I appreciate the question very much, and I'd love to hear more about your work as well.
Yes, please.
My question draws a little bit on this idea of different communities, but specifically for Domenico, you've introduced us, at least me for the first time, to a whole new genre of interesting literature. One thing I noticed about your choices was they were all in English. Does a similar Italian-Canadian queer writing in the recent years also exist in French-speaking Canada? And if so, is it similar or very different than what you've presented today?
I think because of linguistic policy and educational policy in Canada, many Italians who came over in the 1960s, 1970s went into the English school system. And so that's why you have, there is some in French, but it's much, much more, by far, the writing is in English, or Italian even. There's a mixture of Italian dialects with English in the text. But it's simply because the community, until the late 1970s, they went to English school, right? And so that's why you have that. Yeah.
But a lot of those writers are also based in Quebec or Montreal or in Francophone speaking, so they use those languages, multiple languages in their lives and often in their writing.
Is there any other question? Please.
Is it true to say that in Quebec, there is a lot more queer writing, and it has come out than Ontario? Can we say that?
Are you speaking specifically of Italian Canadian? Are you?
Yes.
No, because some of these writers from Salvatore Antonio is from Toronto. Right, we have people from all over the country, so it's not specifically a Quebec thing.
May I follow with another question, if I'm permitted?
Sure.
I know that recently in Montreal, there have been conferences where your colleagues that you mentioned, Di Raddo, for instance, they are presenting their work. And it's new to the community, and it's considered marginalized literature, but it's coming to the fore. And so the Italian community, in quotes, has been introduced to this writing. Do you agree that there's an openness now, or is it still it stigmatizes? Is it still that way?
I would say it depends on the population you're talking about. For instance, with Chris Dorado, we've organized a bunch of events at Casa d'Italia, right? Which is, amazing, right? Because it's, traditionally, very traditional values and so on. So there is an openness to it, but there's also a backlash, right? I mean, I was talking to a colleague, Licia Canton, you probably know, who said, like, there was some backlash to what is this kind of writing and so on, right? So, but overall, I would say there's an interest and an acceptance of it, and it's something new, and so that's in itself is already something interesting, right? So yeah, for sure.
If I can just add an anecdote, I was at the launch of a similar project at the Columbus Center in Toronto, which is kind of a hub for the community there. The large exhibit space that they use for like gallery exhibits was entirely full. And when I spoke to the culture coordinator there, he said that was the fullest it had been since he had started. So I'm sure there's backlash, of course. I think any project of meaning is going to receive some pushback, but it was really amazing to be in that room and the energy and the interest.
Okay, I think the noises from there tell us that lunch is almost ready. Thank you for being here and for this interesting discussion.